one of the questions that we decided to set out right up front before we get into some of the other issues is, how sure can we be that this really is the Word of God? And saying the same thing another way, how sure can we be that Jesus Christ really was who he said he was? Or I should say is who he said he is, be more precise. How sure can we be? Now, as a springboard, we're going to take a look at Peter. Peter's second letter happens to allude that he was an eyewitness of some of the most fantastic events in the gospel period. In 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 16, Peter says, "We have not followed cunningly devised fables when we made known unto you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but were eyewitnesses of his majesty." All Peter's saying here, we're telling you what we saw. We were eyewitnesses. A few verses later, he says, in verse 19, he says, "We have also a more sure word of prophecy, whereunto you do well that you take heed, as unto a light that shineth in a dark place, until the day dawn and the day star arise in your hearts." I want to look at this strange phrase that Peter uses. Peter was an eyewitness. He was making a specific allusion to the transfiguration, when they were up there and they saw Jesus glorified. He was an eyewitness. You say, what could be more certain than that? Peter himself says he has something even more certain than that. More certain than being an eyewitness present at that time. And that's what he calls the more sure word of prophecy. What is he talking about? We're going to first take a look at prophecy, not in the sense of, gee, what's going to happen next week or next month or next year. Let's take a look at prophecies that were spelled out and came true to prove to us that God really is who he said he is. William Thompson, who later was known as Lord Kelvin, one of the great men of science, is famous for pointing out that until we measure a thing, we really know very little about it. It's one thing to point out to a little verse here and notice how it's fulfilled there and so forth. That's fine. But let's see if we can do that in a way that's a little more quantitative, a little more systematic. And the Old Testament, what the Jews would call the Tanakh, we're going to talk about prophecies in the Old Testament. Because there's a fact about the Old Testament you can verify for yourself with any competent encyclopedia. The Hebrew scriptures that we call the Old Testament, the Tanakh to the Jew, were translated into Greek by 270 BC. It started about 285 BC when Ptolemy Philadelphus II funded 70 scholars to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. Why is that so important? Because it's a matter of history. We have copies of that work product, and they were around 3 centuries before the gospel period. That's a matter of secular record. So for the moment, we can set aside who wrote what book. Did Daniel really write Daniel? All of that. It was in black and white, in tangible form, 3 centuries before Jesus was preaching and so forth. Now, these scriptures contain over 300 prophecies detailing the coming Messiah. Over 300 prophecies that were fulfilled back in the 1st century AD. So what we're going to do is, by the way, let me give you some samples of these. And I'm not going to go 300, relax. But I'm just going to list the ones that are quoted in the New Testament as being fulfilled. Jesus was to be of David's family. You'll find that in 2 Samuel, all through the Psalms, all through Isaiah. He would be born of a virgin. That was hinted at in the Garden of Eden. And it's also confirmed to Isaiah in Isaiah 7:14. We always see that on the Christmas cards and so forth. He would be born in Bethlehem in Micah 5:2. He would sojourn in Egypt in Hosea 11:1. He would live in Galilee. In fact, he'd live in Nazareth in Isaiah. He would be announced in advance by an Elijah-type herald in Isaiah 40 and Malachi 3. In fact, the Old Testament closes with that specific promise. He would occasion the massacre of Bethlehem's children. That's mentioned in Genesis 35 and Jeremiah 31. And those are alluded, these connections aren't contrived, they are documented in the New Testament as being fulfilled. He would proclaim a jubilee to the world. His mission would include the Gentiles. Yes, that's all through the Old Testament. His ministry would be one of healing, Isaiah emphasizes. He would teach through the use of parables for a number of reasons. He would be disbelieved and rejected by the religious rulers of that period. He would make a triumphal entry into Jerusalem. He'd be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. And he would be smitten like a shepherd, as his sheep would be scattered. He would be given vinegar and gall. They would cast lots for his garments. His side would be pierced. Not a bone would be broken. That was specified in the requirements for the Passover in Exodus 12 and in Numbers 9, and also is declared specifically messianically in Psalm 34. He would die among criminals. His dying words were foretold. He would be buried by a rich man. He would rise from the dead on the third day. That's in Genesis, in the Psalms, in Jonah, Hosea, and elsewhere. And his resurrection would be followed by the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, I said these Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek 270 BC. They contain over 300 prophecies. We're going to go look at all 300 of them, right? No, relax. What we are going to do, we're going to pick the 8 simplest ones I could find. Just 8 of them. But we're going to try to quantize them as they go. We're going to look at 8 of them. The first one is probably familiar to most of our ears. It's in Micah 5:2. You remember when the Magi came to Herod? Where is he to be? That's going to be born King of the Jews. And he had his scholars check. They dug up Micah 5:2, and they quote this verse as being prophetic of the Messiah. It says, "But thou, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me, that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from old, from everlasting." We could spend the evening on this verse. There's so many things hidden away in this verse that's amazing. Not just that he was born in Bethlehem, but that he pre-existed from eternity past, and much more. But the point is, all we want to extract here is the fact that the Messiah be born in Bethlehem. Now I want you to stop and think about it. What's the probability of somebody being born in Bethlehem over the last 2,000 years? How can we approach that? Well, we can take a look at the world, and we can start zeroing in on that Middle East, Israel, Jerusalem. As we move into Jerusalem, we finally go south of Jerusalem. There's a place called Bethlehem, and this little town has a population of less than 7,000, pretty much unchanged through history. So what's the probability that somebody you ever might meet in the last 2,000 years was born in Bethlehem? Well, if we assume, we're going to use just round numbers and stay conservative. Let's assume that the population of Bethlehem is less than 10,000. That's a safe assumption. Let's assume that the average population at any point in time over the last 2,000 years is something in the nature of a billion people. So the probability of someone picked at random is roughly the ratio of 10,000 to 1 billion. And the way you can deal with round numbers, the scientists and engineers typically just round them off in powers of 10. So we have 10 to the 4th divided by 10 to the 9th, or putting it another way, there's one chance in 10 to the 5th, or one chance in 100,000 of meeting someone born in Bethlehem. How many of you have ever met someone born in Bethlehem? I see. We've got 1, 2, good for you. Have you visited there? Since then, you've been. That's unusual, okay. All I know is that you probably met more than 100,000 in that sample, okay, in total number. But let's take a second one. This is a change of subject now. But it's another famous prophecy in Zechariah 9, verse 9, where the prophet says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, thy king cometh unto thee. He is just and having salvation, lowly, and riding upon an ass, and upon a colt, the foal of an ass." Zechariah 9:9, a famous verse because Jesus deliberately fulfills this in the triumphal entry. And we'll be looking at that later. But the point is, how many people throughout history have presented themselves as a king to Jerusalem riding a donkey? Well, I have no idea, but if I said less than 1 in 100, am I being generous? I think so, okay? So I'm going to use that as my plug figure. I'm going to suggest to you someone presenting himself as a king riding a donkey, there's less than 1 in 100, all right? Now, let's go to the third one. There's another cute little phrase in Zechariah 11, where God says through Zechariah, "said unto them, if ye think good, give me my price, and if not, forbear." So they weighed for my price 30 pieces of silver. Okay, and obviously most of you are aware of the fact that's the precise value that Jesus was betrayed for. Question, how many people throughout history have been betrayed for that precise figure, 30 pieces of silver? Well, I don't happen to know any, but if I say less than 1 in 1,000, are we together? If I look at all the ransom issues or places people have been betrayed and somehow lump them together, I'm going to suggest there's less than 1 in 1,000 that had that specific price. Are we together? That makes sense? I'm being conservative, I think. Okay. The next verse adds some additional details. I'm going to treat it separately. The Lord said unto me, cast it to the potter, a goodly price that I was prized out of them. I took the 30 pieces of silver and cast them to the potter in the house of the Lord. This strange little verse here. And as you read that in the Old Testament, it might not come home. When you get to the New Testament, we'll refresh your memory of what happened after Judas betrayed Jesus. Then Judas, which betrayed him, when he saw that he was condemned, repented himself, brought again the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned in that I have betrayed innocent blood. That's a remarkable statement because we know that by then Satan had entered Judas. So by Satan's own words, we declare Jesus' innocence. I think that's kind of a provocative thing, but let's go on. And the chief priest said, what's that to us? You see to that. In other words, a deal's a deal. It's a done deal as far as they're concerned. So he cast down the 30 pieces of silver in the temple, departed, and went out and hanged himself. This is all out of Matthew 27. So these 30 pieces of silver, where are they now? They're laying on the temple floor, right? Well, the chief priests took the silver pieces and said, it is not lawful to put them into the treasury because it is the price of blood. There was a rule against that. It was unlawful for the priests to put in the treasury blood money. But you have to remember the chief priests had good CPAs, okay? And they took counsel and bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in. In other words, what's lurking behind this is they couldn't take the cash and put it in the treasury. That was against the rules. But what they could do, they decided, was to use the cash to prepay some expenses. The temple was liable. If a stranger died in the precincts, they were liable to take care of the funeral and the arrangements. That was an expense of the temple. They had to find someplace to bury him. Well, there happened to be a potter's field that was a bargain deal right now, so they took the cash, bought the potter's field so they had a field where they could bury strangers in. They're prepaying anticipated expenses. So they took counsel, brought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in, wherefore that field was called the field of blood unto this day. Well, let's go back to Zechariah 11, verse 13. Notice the details that are in this little verse. The price is 30 pieces of silver. Where does the transaction take place? In the house of the Lord, that is in the temple. Who ends up with the money? The guy that owns the field, the potter. Isn't that wild? What's the probability that that just happened by chance? That was random. If I say less than 1 in 100,000, I could say 1 in a million and pull it off. Let's say 100,000. Let's be cautious, okay? Let's take the next one. This one has a lot of personal impact for me. I'll explain why in a minute. In Zechariah 13, verse 6, there's a strange verse. It says, one shall say unto him, what are these wounds in thine hands? And then he shall answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. I can remember as a teenager coming across this verse, and in those days I was on kind of a kick to collect prophecy verses. So when I found a verse like this, I would type it up on a little card, the verse on one side and the reference on the other, and I'd add it to my collection to try to learn it. And I thought, wow, here's, wounds in his hands and so forth. I thought that's a prophecy of the Messiah. And so I added to my collection. But as I tried to memorize it, I kept stumbling. It didn't make sense. The more I looked at it, the less sense it made. And one shall say unto him, what are these wounds in thine hands? And then he shall answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. Well, the more I thought about it, I had to admit to myself that didn't fit the mental image I had. I can't visualize Jesus laying out his hands on these 12 by 12s or whatever they were, and them driving spikes into his hand, the Roman soldiers driving spikes into his hands as being wounded in the house of his friends. That just somehow, I had trouble with that. Until I was reading in John chapter 20. You may recall that first night after the Emmaus Road that evening, he appeared to the disciples after his resurrection. But Thomas wasn't with him, all right? The next day, they saw Thomas and said, boy, you should have been at the prayer meeting last night. Guess who showed up? And Thomas expressed his famous doubt. He said unto them, except I shall see in his hands the print of his nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe. See, Thomas was from Missouri, as we would say in our provincial format. And well, after 8 days, again, the disciples were within, and Thomas this time was with them. Then came Jesus, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst and said, peace be unto you. Then he went over to Thomas. He said, Thomas, reach hither thy finger, and behold my hands, and reach thither thy hand, and thrust it in my side, and be not faithless, but believing. That must have shook up Thomas to realize that Jesus heard every word he says. He hears every word you and I say too. Thomas answered and said unto him, and I visualize Thomas falling on his knees when he says this. It doesn't say that. That's just my interpretation. Thomas answered and said unto him, my Lord and my God. And Jesus said unto him, Thomas, because thou hast seen me, thou hast believed. Blessed are they that have not seen and yet have believed. Then I suddenly realized that verse in Zechariah 13:6. What are these wounds in thy hands? Then he shall answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. What wounded Jesus was not the nails. It was Thomas's unbelief. But let's get back to 13:6. How many people taken at random have been wounded in their hands in the house of their friends? Well, if I say less than 1 in 1,000, am I being generous? I think so. Let's take the next one, number 6. We have to always pick at least one or a couple from Isaiah 53. God says through Isaiah, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. And of course, can't help but remark when we see Jesus in those 6 trials that occurred that night, 3 Jewish and 3 Roman trials. He made no defense. How many prisoners accused of a capital crime, in other words, death penalty, make no defense even though they're innocent? I suspect if you scan the records, you could probably find somewhere someone who was innocent that went to an execution without making defense. There probably have been, maybe, some in it. But if I say there's less than 1 in 1,000, are we together? I think I'm being generous. Okay. Let's take another one from Isaiah. A few verses later, Isaiah says, he made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. Strange apparent contradiction. His grave is with the wicked, and yet he's with the rich in his death. So what I usually ask is, how many people have died among the wicked, and yet were buried with the rich that were not attorneys? And of course, I'm being flippant here. Seriously, how many people have died among the wicked and buried with the rich? Again, if I say less than 1 in 1,000, am I being generous? I think that the intrinsic paradox could be reflected in a higher number, but let's go on. Let's take just one more, and we can't go through this without going to Psalm. Psalm 22 reads as if it was dictated first person singular as Jesus hung on the cross, even though it was written 800 years earlier. But one of the phrases there we'll pick up on, it says, for the dogs have compassed me, and the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. Now what makes this remarkable, this was penned by David 700 years before crucifixion was invented. Remember that in Israel, the form of capital punishment was stoning. When they killed somebody for a crime or whatever, they stoned them. That was the official form of punishment. But here we have, in 700 years, crucifixion was invented by the Persians, about 90 BC. It was adopted heavily by the Romans, of course, and so on. But it was invented by the Persians. But here, this was penned 700 years before the fact, and yet the whole psalm graphically portrays. In fact, there have been articles in the American Medical Association journals taken from Psalm 22 and analyzing the medical cause of death. It's that detailed. But let's get back to this. How many people taken at random have died by having their hands and feet pierced? A lot of people probably have, but if I say less than 1 in 10,000, I think I'm being generous. Because there's so many people killed by so many other methods, I think I'm being generous. 1 in 10,000 being killed by a crucifixion-like method, I think that's fair. Okay, what I've done, I've dragged you through 8 of these. Born in Bethlehem, riding a donkey, presenting himself king on a donkey for 30 pieces of silver. The transaction occurs in the temple, ends up with a potter and all that. There were wounds in the hands, his no defense, though innocent. Died with the wicked, made his grave with the rich, crucified. Okay, we have these estimates, obviously just loose estimates, but we think cautious estimates. The question now is, what is the probability, given, let's assume for discussion purposes, these probabilities are conservative. In other words, the events are actually even more rare than this, but that's fine. What's the probability that a particular person fulfilled all 8 of these? Well, to do this properly, we have to have a feeling for what's called composite probability. So indulge me a little bit further. Let's assume I have a room here of 100 people. And let's assume that 60% of the people in this room are male and 40% of the people in this room are female. Okay, and let's assume there's 100 of you. What's the probability that if I was blindfolded and I somehow picked one of you at random, that I pick a female? Well, it's pretty obvious. If I have 100 people, I've got 40 females, 60 males, and if they're uniformly mixed up and I touch one, the probability is 40% that I got a female. Are you with me so far? Does that make sense? Okay. Now let me take a different characteristic. Let's assume that I have in this population 60% of you are right-handed and 40% of you are left-handed. And let's also, for the purpose of the discussion, let's assume that those attributes are uniformly distributed. There isn't a tendency for men or women to be one or the other. Let's assume for this discussion that their attributes uniformly distributed. So what's the probability if I blindfolded, touched one of you, got somebody that was left-handed? Again, it would be what? 40%. 40 of you are left-handed, 60 of you are right-handed. If you're mixed up uniformly, I touch one of you, there's a 40% chance. Okay, and the reason I'm building this, what I want to get to now is, what's the probability of my touching somebody at random that's a left-handed female? Assuming I'm blindfolded and everybody's uniformly mixed up, whatever. Well, I take the one distribution, which is 40% left-handers. I take the other distribution, which is 40% females, and I put those two distributions together, and what I get, of course, the probability of left-handed female is 40% times 40%, which is 16%. 0.4 times 0.4 is 0.16. In other words, the way I get the composite estimate is to multiply the probability distributions. That's all I'm trying to point out. Now, those of you that are sophisticated in advanced statistics say you should apply Bayes' theorem, which makes it just a little more rare. I'm going to spare you all that. This will be good enough for our purposes, trust me. Okay, the probability is technically even a little smaller, but let's go on. Well, now I have these 8 prophecies, born in Bethlehem, king of donkey, etc., these 8 prophecies. Since I've used powers of 10, it's easy to multiply them because all I have to do is count the zeros. This, in effect, the composite probability of these 8, of one person fulfilling these 8 prophecies is 1 chance in 10 to the 28th, 10 with 28 zeros after it. That's a pretty big number. But if you're going to be precise, you say, by the way, you should divide that by the total population during the last 2,000 years, whatever. And I'm going to say, I'm just going to stipulate that, let's just use 100 billion as a horseback estimate. Okay? So I divide the 1028 by 10 to the 11th, and you just divide by subtracting exponents. That's 10 to the 17th. Now, if I was in a statistics class here, the way you try to get a feeling for, say, 1 chance in 100, we typically take a bucket. And let's say we put 100 silver dollars in there. I take one of the silver dollars and I mark it with someone's lipstick or nail polish or something and put it in there, and we mix it all up. 99 unmarked ones, 1 marked. We mix it all up. The chance of my reaching in there and getting the one we marked is 1 chance in 100. That's a way of conveying what we mean by saying 1 in 100. You with me? Well, here I've got a situation where I've got 10 to the 17th. So what I need to do is get a bucket and put 10 to the 17th silver dollars in there. That turns out to be a pretty big bucket. In fact, I need a bucket that'll have 10 to the 17th silver dollars, and what I need is the state of Texas. And I fill it with silver dollars, it'll turn out to be 2 feet deep. 10 to the 17th is a big number. The chance of one person fulfilling those 8 prophecies is equivalent to my marking one of those silver dollars in Texas 2 feet deep, mixing them up in such a way that it could be anywhere, reaching down blindfolded and picking up one and picking up one that's marked, is 1 chance in 10 to the 17th. That obviously is pretty unlikely.